Robert Pierson. I am the Senior Vice President and MD for Americas for Borderless Access. You're joining us for a very important webinar, which is focusing on bringing a local lens to the pursuit of global equity through the lens of research and TV programming. I'm joined by my co-host, Nina Ocon, former Director of Latino Programming for NBC Universal and Peacock. Nina, if you'd like to introduce yourself to the audience and talk about some of your experience in this area.
Yes, thank you so much, Robert, for this invitation. Thank you for hosting such a timely conversation around a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, for sure. Like you mentioned, my name is Nina Ocon. I am a marketing director and content programmer. I am based in South Florida, where I run a marketing firm that offers solutions around operations and program management, specifically for marketers that are trying to do work around audience development and consumer engagement. Like you mentioned, I am former NBCU, where I spent a considerable amount of time heading up the social media marketing team for Telemundo. And then I went over to Peacock, where I was part of the launch team for the streaming service, and I oversaw Latino content programming. And this conversation will inform a lot of this conversation will draw from my time there to inform the topics that we'll be talking about today that I think a lot of people in the room can relate to.
Great, thank you very much. So as we know, the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, also the Corporate Roundtable in the United States, which is made up of the biggest corporations over here, have had a very big focus on cultural responsibility. This includes racial equity and diversity in marketing. It also includes understanding audiences as key stakeholders and how they drive business, focusing on the culture of people at an individual level. At Borderless Access, as an organization, we focused on cultural nuance right from our inception 15 years ago. Focusing on being localized and a culturally sensitive approach, which focuses not only on language, but also on brands and other areas which have allowed us to step into this area. From a point of view of other organizations who have this built into their DNA, I know that Nina's going to be addressing some of the key issues that she faced when she was at the NBC Universal and Peacock in terms of programming, but corporations that have been doing this right from the very get-go are corporations like Unilever and Estee Lauder. Estee Lauder focuses on cultural nuance right down to the level of skin. They have this built into their DNA, not only in the cultures where they operate in terms of where they're selling, but also across the businesses that they run and the countries where they operate. Unilever has done the same thing in terms of a diverse approach in terms of how that works. This has led to these companies being very successful over the years and gives them that length of sustainability, which was built into the UN tenets in 1992. So with that, I would like to need to focus on Nina and what's done, how this has worked in terms of TV programming, in terms of being culturally responsive.
Absolutely, Robert. Thank you. And we're going to double click on the Latino audience at large, just because I believe that a lot of the fundamentals of the things that we're going to be speaking about are relevant to anyone who is a marketer, a content planner that is looking to reach any audience. I think that there are a lot of takeaways from the topics that we'll be talking about that I think are broad enough for it to be applicable to different demographics. But for the purposes of this conversation, we will dive into Latinos in America as it relates to content consumption and potential marketing tactics that you want to apply. So really looking at Latinos in the United States, as of 2020, there were about 65 million Latinos in this country. That is 8 percentage points higher than 2016. So we know that there are way more Latinos in this country than ever before. We know that they're doing different things at much higher volume than they were before, and this makes them an extremely interesting and lucrative audience for marketers to want to tap into, for content programmers, for advertisers, you name it. Everyone wants to be able to say, our campaigns reach Latinos at X percentage. Take alone the purchase power, right, of Latinos. Last recorded purchase power of Latinos in America is nearly $2 trillion. That if they were a GDP alone, it would be a higher gross domestic product than some countries in this world. So they're spending a ton of money, and every campaign wants to be able to say, we reach X amount of Latinos, but really, what does that mean? What does it really look like to reach Latinos? I think there's a lot more depth and breadth than just that blanket statement. From a streaming perspective, we know that Latinos are 40% more likely to purchase and upgrade to a streaming product. So we knew at NBC Universal the importance of Latinos. Definitely knew the importance of Latinos and their content consumption and their habits, and the importance of being able to target them. However, when things come out in the wash, when it's really important to dig into what exactly they're doing, what exactly they're watching, in what language, what's that behavior look like. And a really good example that comes to mind where we did a lot of really good things right, but we might have, missed in some areas, is when there was a really great, amazing title back when I was at the broadcast network that had tons of really great editorial lines around progressive themes, LGBTQ. It was bilingual. It was targeting this crisscrosser, this audience called the 200%er audience, which Telemundo coined really brilliantly. And to this day, it's an amazing term for expressing 100% Latino and 100% American in this country. And it was an amazing title, but it didn't necessarily resonate. Once it hit linear traditional broadcast network, it didn't necessarily resonate with a Spanish dominant audience. Then cut to a couple years later, when it was already on streaming in Latin America, it was doing fantastic numbers. And I knew once we had it over at Peacock, it was probably going to behave in the same way, because the audience that was consuming that type of content was more amenable to that type of content in a different platform, in Netflix, for example, in Latin America. The people that were watching that piece of content in Latin America were more affluent, were more bilingual, were younger, so they were open to more progressive storylines. And it was the case as well when it hit Peacock. It did pretty well. And I think that that's a really great example of a really amazing piece of content that at the inception wasn't programmed to the correct audience and the correct medium. It was maybe a risk, it was maybe a long shot, you name it. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a great piece of content, but in the inception of it, it didn't hit the audience that it was intending to hit right at the start. So I think it's really important to consider all the ways that your audience is going to consume your product, your content, and really slice and dice. Exactly. Thank you, Donna. All the potential opportunities that they're going to consume content, because if you understand the consumption, then you're going to be able to understand what you're trying to achieve at the end of the life cycle of your product. Generally speaking, this framework that I've laid out here is just a very generalized way of showcasing how Latinos are consuming content. These are not buckets necessarily. They could also be Venn diagrams, but for the purposes of the conversation, for the purpose of you understanding cultural nuance within your audience that you're trying to reach, you might want to look at how Latinos are consuming content, and how programmers are approaching this. You can look at content from a language perspective, right? So you have Spanish language content. This is content that is endemically created in language. It is meant to attract the Spanish dominant audience. A good example of this is Casa de Papel, which went on to this day is one of the top performing pieces of content for Netflix. This is a Spanish language title that was born out of Spain that then took off. It is a Spanish language content, period. It could be consumed by many different people, but it is first a Spanish language piece of content. Then you have Latino-led content. This is content that Latinos are in the top roles. They're casted as leads. There aren't necessarily cultural tie-ins in the editorial line. This just happens to be a Latina or a Latino in a leading role. You can consider Marry Me as an example, Superstore with America Ferrer, where it's not screaming in your face. This is for the Latino audience, but Latinos might be attracted to it because there's a Latino in the leading role. Only Murders in the Building with Selena Gomez is also an example of a show that could be Latino-led if you needed to programmed it within that category. You have Latino relevant content. This is content that is specifically intended to speak to the culture of that audience, right? It could be documentaries around food. It could be documentaries around values. On My Block and Netflix speaks to the Latino culture first because it's written for that audience. Going Varsity and Mariachi is a really beautiful documentary around the history and prominence of the mariachi culture within Mexican communities. That's really special. And then you have over-indexing content, and this is kind of the most nebulous one, but it's important to highlight here because it's the over-indexing content. It is basically the catch-all. It is content that has nothing to do with Latinos, but for whatever reason, Latinos are watching it at scale. WWE, for example, the NFL, animated movies. I mean, I think WWE at one point, I think it had over 16% overlap with Latino audiences. This is just content that Latinos are watching a lot. Yellowstone, The Office, Fast and Furious might kind of blend in over into other categories, but this one is kind of the one that is a little bit of a head scratcher because at the end of the day, you're capturing a ton of Latinos. So maybe advertisers and marketers are being like, oh yeah, we're doing our job, we're capturing Latinos, but you're capturing Latinos with content that the entire world is watching. So it's not super specific to that audience, right? And I think that sometimes gets in the way of the data at the end of the day. But this is a couple ways that you could consider the complexities of consumer behavior for just one audience. If we go on to the next slide, we will also examine ways that content programming also comes into play. So we know that they're watching content in a litany of different ways. And we know that good content is always going to rise to the top. We know that good content is also language agnostic. So take Parasite, for example. Parasite won the Oscar. However, it was strategically programmed across different markets to aid the discovery, right? Parasite, when it hit the US market, we knew right away that it was Parasite. None of us maybe necessarily realized that it was in a different language until we started watching the movie, but the subtitles were already available. We were able to consume it, and it was an amazing story. This is a really great example that a title is well positioned for success because it's coming out of the gate realizing that the intention of it is to reach as many people as possible. Flaming Hot is a really good example of a documentary that sometimes gets bucketed into Latino relevant content because it's just, it's about this Latino man who, influenced the Flaming Hot Cheetos. But this piece of content can resonate with any audience, regardless of language, regardless of ethnicity, because it touches on themes related to hard work, resilience, entrepreneurship. So it needs to be it can't just be regaled to a Latino piece of content. It's for everyone, but it needs to also be programmed correctly. It needs to be tagged correctly. It needs to be showcased within the library of content so that it has a chance for discovery. And both of these are really great pieces of work that don't need any discovery. Everyone knows it, but they're good examples of how cultural nuance plays a role in the campaign marketing, as well as the content programming.
I think we've seen this through our research too. We recently worked with an anime provider. We're trying to break into the Indian market. They've been told by researchers that the general language across India that's understood is English. And so they've done all their research in English across India. But being a company that's headquartered in India and operates across the globe, what we know is for a fact that there are 65 different languages in India. There are multiple cultures that are in addition to that. Understanding the audience first and understanding where you need to target really is the key to doing this. When we look at the diaspora of the United States, we've talked about Latinos not being a monolith, that there are multiple different cultures that exist within that Spanish-speaking group. We can look at other markets where people have made vast generalizations. If you're dealing with Asian Americans, you go all the way from South India, all the way right the way through to places like Korea and Japan and China and other nationalities. And you need to address these people individually, or you need to find a common goal that addresses them in terms of the audiences that they they want to engage with and the questions that they need answered in order to sell to them in an effective way, or even to program to them in a specific way. Understanding your audience first is the key to kind of getting to that point. You can't focus on multiple, if you're going to go at them as a group, and we've seen this in the recent elections, you can't just focus on them all the individual needs at one time. You need to focus on what are the underlying issues that our people are facing. And regardless of where you fell in terms of that recent election, as we've seen through next slide, what we've seen is that things have gone from there. We've seen that there is a key intersection of groups. If you focus on multiple issues at the same time, you are going to have some challenges in terms of dealing with that. If you focus on what the underlying challenges, and Nina and I were talking about this before this call, even talk about Latinos specifically, is that the issues addressed, it's about people's financial well-being. And that's the thing that underlied the win of the election. And rather than focusing on every individual issue and trying to deal with every individual group, as we look at this from an AI perspective, the cultural biases that are created right now through human measurement are going to be reflected in AI. So those groups that have been segmented as a result of this, as a result of the way that we research, and have been minimized through that research, through us not understanding their needs, their languages, their cultures, the brands that they follow, it's going to be reflected as AI takes over in terms of technology. What AI will do is it will elevate that cultural bias because it's reliant on the information that we have in place when we're doing this measurement in order to do this. So having good quality research as you're beginning your journey of measurement and addressing the different brands really is kind of the key to doing this. Nina, I know you've got some key points that you've really thought about in terms of where this fits from an orchestration standpoint, if you want to talk about that.
Absolutely. And I think your point on AI is really important because in order to give the AI a chance, right, in order for AI to spit out the most accurate representation of whatever you're prompting it or whatever it's helping you do, it needs to be taught the correct information and it needs to be fed with as much information at the start. It needs to be set up for success, right? And I think that is the part that marketers and campaign planners, even content programs sometimes have a challenge with, because we might want to say we want to reach Latinos. At the end, we don't care. We just want X percentage of increase in Latinos. But if you don't fully understand what type of Latino you're going to be speaking to and what type of Latino you might be expecting to reach at the end of your campaign, you're going to have major blind spots. And this comes, even consider how you are building out your reporting structure, right? At the front of the campaign and at the front of building your teams and at the front of really considering what you're going to launch into the market, you and your data, your statistician, your analyst, your insights team are one. The marketer and the insights team kind of go through the entire life cycle hand in hand. And there needs to be a lot of transparency in the front with what you want them to pull and what data you want them to be able to generate so that you can provide your best narrative around the campaign success and what potentially didn't go so well. And that takes a lot of methodical and orchestration, like we mentioned on the slide, in the front. Everything from the tagging of the content, the metadata, the way that the asset and the product are going to be displayed in the market, in the program, in the service, etc., has to be really thoughtfully considered. Because what's going to happen is you're going to go to your data teams and you're going to be like, oh, data team, please spit me out every, the top performing, we're going to use this example, the top performing Latino content. And all of a sudden the data team is going to be like, great, here it is. And then you're going to look at it and it's going to be all Spanish language content. And you're going to be sitting there being like, well, I didn't run a Spanish language campaign. My hero asset, what I was putting into the market, the product I was launching, the program I was, shepherding was in English. What do you mean that the top performing content is in Spanish? Oh, well, it's because all of the back end work was done to only reflect Spanish language. So there was, implicit bias in the front end of it. There was, a lack of awareness. Sometimes people don't know what they don't know, right? There was major blind spots. So therefore, you have an official number that you have that you cannot report on because it doesn't accurately reflect the truth of what you were trying to achieve. So therefore, you need to go in at the front and say, listen, like, no matter how hard it is, this is what we need to get to at the end. And if you don't set it up correctly, you're basically going to encounter a lot of challenges in the reporting process. You're going to have a lot of gaps within your performance because you're not going to be generating the data that you need in order to be able to make a case for how you're growing that audience. So it's really, really, truly important that you think about, okay, I want this audience, but what type of audience? And then making sure that you have the correct creative in place, the right tactics in place, the right teams, right? Hire the right copywriters, hire the right analysts, the right everything starts from the beginning. And if you do that work and you're willing to have the patience for it and the fortitude to really think about those things, then I truly believe that the campaigns will be better for it. The programs will be better. The programming will be better. The planning, everything in the execution will be a lot more considerate to the audience that you are then going to be so excited about telling your advertisers and your groups that you're reaching.
So yeah, this absolutely reflects in terms of the work that we've done as an organization. And in terms of different tools that we've put in place that have helped us to understand this over the years, we have tools for brand affinity tracking, which allow you to understand at an individual level what the audiences that you're measuring are. What are their key desires? What are where do they fit in? What are the languages that they're speaking in? Who are the people that they listen to? What are the key drivers that are behind that? We also think from a point of view of the experience those people have when intersecting with your brands, when buying them, when purchasing them, when looking at them, and looking at those drivers at an individual level with understanding their cultural nuance will allow you to do that. So the question really comes down to, from your market and how you're addressing it, do you understand what's driving your market amongst the individual groups that are most important to you? Do you know who those people are and where does that fit in? And have you done the groundwork in the background in order to do that? Nina, I don't know if you want to summarize with 2 or 3 points in terms of how that looks for you and advice that you could give our audience going out before we turn to questions.
For sure. I think the first takeaway I would say is be very honest about the audience that you have in the beginning. And it's okay if that audience doesn't necessarily reflect and mirror the audience that you want in the future. But be very honest that if the audience that you have is maybe, I'm making it up, it's maybe Spanish language, and that's the bulk of your audience, there's a wealth of opportunity in that audience. There's nothing wrong with that audience. There's a lot of opportunity within that audience. There's a lot of potential money to be made with that audience. And if that's the audience that you have and you want to reach another audience, you need to consider, what will you do? Will you completely abandon that audience? Will you then change your entire strategy to go reach another audience? Or will you hunker down and really foster and grow and really become an authority in that audience, right? And that could be for any, nuance within your culture, right? I'm just using Latinos as an example, but be very honest about the audience that you have and be thoughtful if you decide to grow that one and own it and be an authority within that space, or if you're going to decide to branch out and be the authority in another audience. And then understand the risks that are with that. It doesn't happen overnight. You don't go from being a Spanish dominant audience to a leader in bilingual Latinos in America overnight. And NBC Universal did a lot of work to be able to achieve that. It wasn't, we didn't start off by just being a Spanish language broadcast network, and then at the end of the road, the leading U.S. Hispanic brand across multiple channels, it was a lot of work. We were very, very thoughtful in that space. So I would say the first takeaway is own the audience that you have, decide if that's really the one that you want to keep, and then understand that the path forward might be a little bit long and have the patience to grow that audience. The second would be do the work, plan it out, hire the right people in place, really become one with your data teams. Do everything you can to set up the reporting correctly in the front end of everything, even if it takes longer, even if, invest in the data tools first, invest in your analytics team first, grow that team. Those are the ones that the marketers rely on the most. And if you're not doing that in the beginning and you're trying to retrofit it at the end, it's really like you're putting it's like you have a hole and you're not really patching it up correctly, and water's just going to continue to come in. And the third is have the fortitude and the ability to test. Sometimes, so often I've run into issues where, we were so confident that this is the right approach that we didn't really have the desire to include A/B testing within our campaigns, because we really, really felt that that was the one that we needed to go with. And even if it's one small tweak that we're not going to necessarily highlight, we're just going to put small efforts against, like, do test it, do go into market with multiple versions of creative, multiple versions of captioning, and try to see what comes out of the wash. Even in the most successful campaigns, you always identify something you could have done differently, and there's always learning from being able to do A/B testing. So I would definitely encourage those three things.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think in conclusion, I mean, it's a create, test, and learn environment. Understand your audience from a key perspective. Do the research right at the very beginning. Focus on the cultural nuances and what you're trying to achieve from that work. Because if you focus on that effectively, you will get to a point where you understand your audiences, and that will be reflected in the responses you get back, which will lead to you selling more product, doing more services. We've seen organizations that have done this in a very effective way. In the programming area, organizations like Netflix have been very good at, in terms of the audiences they've addressed, the markets that they operate in. From a cosmetics perspective, we talked about Estee Lauder. There are others like Coca-Cola who've been doing this very well over the years and have this built into their DNA, and continue to examine and understand their audiences at a local and global basis. So with that, I think we'll end this, and we'll turn to any questions that we may have from the audience here.
I see a question. Robert, if you want me to jump in.
Yes.
It reads, if I had little budget and not a lot of time, what are the roles that I need to staff up for at the beginning of my process? This is a really great question. I do get it often. And I would say the most important roles that you need to consider when you're trying to effectively run a marketing organization or your campaign, or you're about to start a product, is you have to have your brand lead, someone that truly understands the brand, the values of that brand, who's going to be the advocate for what that brand is ultimately going to live and die by. And then the second person you need to hire is your data analyst, someone that truly can complement that brand lead and is able to synthesize the metrics for you. And together you both, create the marketing, actually campaign by, and every step of the marketing campaign informed by what's the KPI for this milestone in the campaign, what's the KPI for this, and then making sure that your analyst is being able to have the tools in place to be able to report on everything. And then the third piece of that would be a really great content creator, someone that, they consider them predators, they have different names for it, but someone that can do video and content creation in a very scrappy way that understands all the different AI's tools and isn't afraid to not only edit but also shoot content. I think it's very important. Sometimes you get into a bubble where it's like, I only edit, I only photo edit, and then someone's like, I only video, shoot, and then sometimes you just need a young, scrappy person that can do it all. So if you have those three things in place, I think that you're going to be in a good spot.
So I think one of the questions that I read here is about looking at promoting global equity and what happens if you're a brand that's already established in certain markets. How do you put that global equity in place? So I think the key is in terms of understanding what are your key partnerships and where they come from. From a research perspective, it's looking at the individual audiences. What are their preferences? What are the existing brands that already work in that market from your competitive set? Maybe it's a question of a brand refresh in terms of understanding how you can target those individuals and going from there, doing some comparisons. We've done this with one of the retailers recently where we looked at new markets that they're trying to break into, and we were able to look at what the behaviors of the local communities were in terms of consumption, different things that they did from an entertainment perspective, which allowed this brand to reposition themselves in the market in an effective manner.
Absolutely. That's a good point.
So are there any more questions? So there's another question which has come up is, what are the best ways to mitigate cultural bias in research? I think I'll take that one to start with, and then maybe we can look at it in terms of programming. I think one of the things with cultural bias in research is you need to look at it in terms of the audiences that you're addressing. Who are the people that you're trying to reach? Are you trying to reach a more general audience, or are you trying to address everybody? If you try to address everybody, then your message gets diluted. So what you need to do is to focus on the individual groups that you want to target and ask them specific questions. From a questionnaire perspective, make sure that the questionnaire follows the path of the audience that you're trying to measure in the language that they're trying to measure it. And don't make assumptions based around audiences in terms of how they can do that. I think, Nina, you've seen the same thing in terms of programming, in terms of cultural biases that have already been in place.
Absolutely. And I think that when it comes to mitigating cultural bias, it's very simple. You just have to have the people in the room. You have to build your teams with many people, depending on how large or small your operation is. You have to have someone that understands that audience, and preferably not just understands it, but is from that audience. So if you want to reach more women in general, more women should be in the room. And I can't even tell you, in my early days of my career, because I've always worked within the US Hispanic space, and I've always been in emerging stages and of different products and programs. Just having me in the room helped the conversation because I knew what to ask. So it's very important that you mitigate cultural bias by having the culture that is potentially at risk in the room, and being very honest about the blind spots that they may have. That's the best way to mitigate it. You need to have people that, if you're trying to target Spanish language Latinos that speak Spanish, you need to have people in the room that speak Spanish. And it's not enough to just have, I've learned Spanish, and no, you need to have native Spanish speakers to be able to pinpoint the areas of opportunity, to be able to say, oh, this looks off. If you want to reach Latina women, you need to have them there, and they need to be able to have a voice and impact the campaign and impact the reporting.
I think we've talked about that as well between ourselves before this, when we're getting set up for this webinar as well, is that you've got to think about it in terms of the multiple communities within your audience. It's not just good enough to even talk from a language perspective in terms of the Latino or Latina audience. You've got to think about it in terms of where they are, particularly in the United States, where you've got audiences that may be Mexican or Puerto Rican. You've got audiences which identify exclusively as American, even though they're from a Latino heritage. You've got to look at this from a point of view of ways in which you can address that audience. So it's understanding where your audience is coming from and ways in which you can do that. But it's asking the questions to that audience in terms of what how they represent themselves is very important. And particularly in terms of the way that people think about different things. Um,
I also want to add, Robert, mitigation to add to the mitigation point. Um, a lot of brands, especially on the digital side, they get really they're very turned off by primary data collection, because the way that we collect data sometimes is not in the sexiest, most exciting way. People don't want to give out their information. How many times have you filled out forms and email sign up lists, and it's just, there is fatigue for information, giving out information. But if you, as a brand owner, and as a marketer, you have to get creative with how you can ask that. You have to build out your own primary data. It is, yeah, there's tons of ways to get secondary data and to be able to get enough reporting from third party, but you have to be committed from the start to build an audience that is your own, that is proprietary, that you truly understand. And at the end of the day, it takes time, but if your product is good enough, your audience will fill out in the most engaging way that you can make it possible their name, their sex, their location, their age, you know, any type of fun things that you can get about their consumer behavior. I mean, you have to get to a point where you can find a way to get data from your audience and build an audience that way. It's, if you don't collect primary data from your audience, it's going to be so much harder when you are at your fifth year and you're hitting a plateau and you're like, oh my God, I don't know why my audience isn't, well, you didn't do the effort to sign them up into an email funnel and nurture them for even if that audience is very small, having 50 people that you can pinpoint exactly what they like is a way more effective group of people than sampling 100,000 and then not really knowing.
and I think on the other side of that, and we've done this recently within our own work, is having social media overlays on top of that, looking at different tools that you can hear your audience through. So when you're setting up your research, do that qualitative research in advance, do that work with social media tracking, do that work with and use those connected data platforms with which to really understand your audience directly. Because if you can appeal to them through specific things that they've already talked about, you can ask the questions that are most important to them because you already have hit them at the level that they need to be hit at. Don't make assumptions in terms of how you're building out the questionnaires and surveys that you're building. And in the same in the long form research, it needs to be reflected. So you need to look at things in a holistic way, which allow you to do that in the right sort of way through research. And if you've done that in advance, you can avoid that cultural bias. I think it's also about really understanding what are the drivers that exist around your brand as well. So turning this around from those different groups. So are you asking the questions about what puts your brand at risk from those different audience groups? We've seen companies like Kraft Heinz recently mess up in terms of their most recent advert, where they did an advert for ketchup which hit on old stereotypes, which in theory was very, very strong, but it hit on old stereotypes and offended a whole audience. And while the intention was great right at the very beginning, they hadn't done that homework in advance with the audience that they were addressing in order to do that. And so we have to I think that cultural bias in research and the mitigation of it is a continuous beast that's alive. You have to continue to address this and understand the audiences that you're looking at.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There is a question, Robert, coming in if you want me to read it.
Sure.
It says, convincing some global clients to create local, culturally nuanced content can be hard. One of our biggest clients is global but refuses to create local content. Instead, they're big on influencer partnerships. How can we convince them to create local content? Do you want to take that first?
Sure. So, there's a couple of things that I would look at from that side. It's understanding those key opinion leaders. So they have strong influencer content. How are the content providers from that side, or the influencers that they're working with, how are they addressing their audience right now? What are the different ways in which they can engage those leaders? Because if you look at it from a point of view, and Edelman always talked about these people as amplifiers. So how do you impact the amplifiers in terms of those audiences to be better at what they're doing and represent you as a brand? And realistically, it's standing behind your corporate purpose, making sure that they are reflecting the values that you stand by as an organization, but also that your messaging is affecting those people directly. And if you're doing that in the right way, then you'll overcome this in a very easy way. I'd turn it back to you to talk about it from a programming standpoint. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I think I'm very keen on local content, regardless of whether your brand is global or not. I think that there's a really big opportunity to harness niche communities, and I think that sometimes we want to, spray the market and then just reach as many people all at once. But sometimes it's the smaller local groups that do the most work for you that end up in the long run paying off. So I think that a good first step is just, if it's a global brand, then look at your where are those local audiences, which one is the one that's driving the most growth, even if it's, even if it's small, but it's consistent growth. And encourage your leader to spend some funds on testing a specific, campaign with them. I think that the whole thing has to be, I think, has to be exploratory first, right? I understand if it's a global brand, they're like, okay, but why do we have to go local? We're seeing success within our global strategy. But at the same time, there needs to be an appetite for a risk, and there needs to be an appetite for testing. And I think that if you're in the position to advocate for that test and you see that there's a local audience that could really benefit, I think that, just continue to push for a small campaign, a small targeted initiative towards that, and see what the results yield. I think a lot of the time, once the dust settles, and once there's a crisis, once there's a big, slump in sales, once there's like all of these like negative things happening to an organization, sometimes the local audience or the very niche audience is the one that kind of carries you through. And that's kind of the dark horse and the workhorse that ends up working in your favor. So I would just continue to advocate for a test, a very methodical, targeted test, and hope to expand from there.
And I'd also tag onto that as well. We've seen that through B2B research. In B2B research, people often forget about the different groups that you need to target. They think about specific audiences, but it's those key opinion leaders and those influencers who are the top 10% of your audience, who influence the way that they behave in terms of their different activities. You look at people like Jamie Dimon, for example, from Chase, and you look at the CEO of Walmart in terms of what they're doing. These people have become so influential in terms of B2B and influencing the way that people operate. I mean, the corporate roundtable was created as a result of this. So when you are trying to influence these audiences, you really need to focus on who is the target group and how they can become an ambassador for you. And once you've got those ambassadors in place, regardless if it's B2B or whether it's consumer research, whether you're going for a larger audience, you're able to influence them in the right way to give you the answers that you want to get. And therefore you can target them in the right way so that they again, you will increase your number of ambassadors, you'll increase the number of amplifiers. And there's a butterfly effect, if you like, in terms of how that works. And so that you can really understand the different corporate cultures, or whether it's from a cultural perspective, from different nationalities, whether it's breaking into new markets. It emphasizes all those different areas in terms of how that drives it. And with that, you can redefine reach, you can redefine insights, and go from there.
For sure. And just one more thing on the influencer aspect of it, because I know influencers are definitely a really strong tactic within the marketing funnel, to depending on how you want to use them. But there's two ways of approaching. I mean, there's multiple ways of approaching it, but two ways that you can think of influencers is, maybe you want brand awareness, you want brand reach, and like Robert mentioned, sometimes influencers create a really big halo effect for the brand, and there's a lot of amplification that it helps, but sometimes it doesn't really drive as much conversion as you're looking for. So like, what's really the point of the influencer partnership from the beginning is really important, because if you're trying to drive conversion, sometimes even local influencers are way more effective, because they might be smaller, they might be micro, but you're actually driving influence and you're driving conversion and acquisition. So, if you're on a global stage and you're getting influencers, then maybe that works, because you just want to get earned media, you want to get people to talk about it, and the conversion might be a lot smaller, and that's okay with you. But sometimes at the local level, the conversion might be even higher, because there's more of that very direct niche influence in that community. So consider what exactly the influencer partnership is even doing for the marketing.
But I think going back to the question again in terms of finalizing that, it's how can we convince them to create local content? The only way that you can convince them to create local content is understanding what's currently driving them. So what are the things that are driving your influencers? Focus on them as an audience in themselves, not the greater audience. You need to focus on it in terms of what are the things that are driving them, why are they talking about them, how are they talking about them. So when you're looking at those different partnerships, look at them in terms of finding ways and connections that build the puzzle for that audience. And then there's a reflection in terms of how that will sit, and that will allow you to go from there. I think, yeah, I would love to talk to whoever put that question off. Please feel free to send me an email, and I'd love to continue this conversation more specifically, because I have some other things which I think are tools in place that would help you in terms of what you're doing. I think that just looking at the clock now, I think we're actually 2 minutes over. So thank you very much, Nina, for joining me today. It's been amazing. I've really enjoyed doing this, and hope that there are more questions that are coming back. If you'd like to get hold of me, my name is Robert Pierson. I am based in Chicago. You can email me at robert.pierson@borderlessaccess.com, and go from there. And I look forward to talking to you and understanding your helpful, nuanced needs as you go forward. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.